Okay, I'm insanely late to the party on this. A couple months back, an acquaintance of mine, Rex, wrote this article. What the fuck was the title? I think it was something to the effect of parries make action games worse, or why parries ruin action games. And it went surprisingly viral. I saw a lot of back and forth, a lot of different arguments. Again, I'm very late on it. I don't want to reheat something that's already done and dusted and just pointlessly retread common points. I just felt like with how the discourse has kind of evolved since, I'm not sure it's something that's spread outside of my own bubble very much, but I do feel like I see the parry slop allegations for new game trailers more and more. Obviously, there was Ninja Gaiden 4 recently with its trailer, where I saw that sort of sentiment a lot, complaining about the fact that, or criticizing or being skeptical of the fact that it had parries as a seemingly central mechanic. Obviously, one of the games that was central to the article, Monster Hunter Wilds, has now released. I feel like this is kind of a good time to look back on the discourse and maybe summarize the best perspectives that I've seen on this whole debate. To recap a little bit, a parry in this context means I do a special input just as an attack is about to hit me or just as it's hitting me, somewhere in that window. And generally speaking, I both negate the attack, but also I get some kind of other benefit. So this would include something like Bayonetta's Witch Time. Functionally, it's a parry. Visually, aesthetically, maybe not exactly, but that's the sort of thing we're talking about. I press the button, and if I do it in that window, not only do I negate the attack, but I also get the benefit of Witch Time. You have stuff like Sekiro, where you press the block button just as the attack is about to hit you, and you cause posture damage to the enemy. Revengeance, right, where you do a big counter attack. Third strike, you get a little bit of frame advantage, you get a little bit of meter, you negate chip damage, all these types of implementations. And the argument that Rex poses in his article is that, generally speaking, with a lot of these mechanics, you don't have to consider your previous choices very much as far as defending yourself goes. Your previous decisions, or just the general state of the game, doesn't impact your ability to defend yourself. Again, with a lot of the examples that I've mentioned, that is true. In Bayonetta, it doesn't matter where you're standing exactly. The iframes of the dodge work very much universally, very holistically. In Revengeance, you can instantly turn around in the direction that you want to parry in. And even then, it's like the specific position that you're standing in has no implications on how that works exactly. It's hard to argue with the idea that that is pretty much objectively true. Now, the question is, what does it actually mean for the game? Now, the reason you would point this out is because you're operating under the premise that having all this extra space to play with and to consider makes the game richer and makes decision-making a lot more nuanced and fuzzy and ambiguous. Matthew Matosis wrote a great article about this a while back that gives a lot of very easily understandable examples. The one he really focuses on, the one he really stresses, is Ghosts and Goblins Resurrection, which is a 2D platformer. I think 2D in general makes this very easy to understand. You don't have any kind of iframe functionality in the game whatsoever. And what makes this so compelling is that the enemy design is also very AI driven and a little bit random. You have a lot of things that track you a little bit. You have a lot of things that are not super consistent in terms of their spawn positioning or spawn timing. And what that means is that you might have an enemy coming in, you walk back to avoid them, throw your knives to attack them, but then at the same time, somebody else is spawning from the bottom. This is a super simple scenario, and like when you're playing it, maybe it doesn't seem that special, but you're already intuitively understanding, okay, I kind of have to think a couple moves ahead, which is something you never have to do in like Sekiro, for example. Now, obviously, I don't want to sell these games too short. I mean, Bayonetta is my favorite game of all time, and I think it provides also pretty reasonable examples for setting up your offense bit by bit and actions sort of successively mattering. But I think it's pretty hard to argue with the concept that if there's no negative repercussions to positioning yourself in a certain way, if you can negate every prior decision with just a button press, that it makes the game as a whole a lot less rich than it could be. Now, an obvious argument against this that I've seen a lot that from the perspective of, okay, maybe this way of thinking about parries and thinking about positioning is a little bit too reductive, is that you should think of a parry as a risk-reward situation. You go for the parry, and if you fuck it up, you're in a worse situation than you would have been than if you hadn't tried it in the first place, right? And that makes it an exciting, again, risk-reward relationship. My friend Pang had a really good thread about why this doesn't really hold up. To put it very plainly, a bet like that is not very interesting. If your chance to hit the parry is 50%, then it basically doesn't matter if you go for it. And as soon as you pass the 50% threshold, well, it's basically, again, mathematically, always worth trying. And just because you fuck it up sometimes, that doesn't mean the game suddenly became more interesting. And that leads me to my next point. My friend Björn actually had a response video to Rex's article. It's on his Patreon and it's in German, so it's very unlikely that you'll watch it. But he felt that the article was a little too reductive and a little too simplistic. And one of his central arguments was that, well, if you're judging these games on the theoretical basis that, oh, you could just hit the parry every single time, and now the game is uninteresting, that's too reductive. My counter to that as well, just because I got hit doesn't mean the game is suddenly interesting, right? By the time you have this type of mechanic in the game, the damage is done, right? By the time you build the game around the idea that you can defend yourself from any position, the damage is done. I think the mistake here is looking at timing-based gameplay versus positioning-based gameplay as this dichotomy, which is something that Björn goes into, right? He says, oh, if you're thinking about it on this theoretical basis, then speedrunning would be uninteresting. Rhythm games would be uninteresting because you're just learning a sequence of inputs, right? You're timing a sequence of inputs. And I think if you're sort of led along this line of arguments, you're kind of misunderstanding the premise of this type of article in the first place. This type of arguments against parries is presupposing, is that a word? I don't fucking know. ESL moment. That by utilizing nuanced differences in the game state, in where objects are on the screen, you get a much more rich, much more complex problem to solve for the player. Again, that's what I mean by the damage is done. You're not making the game suddenly interesting by just letting the player get hit more. That's not a problem that you're solving with a parry, right? This is sort of an aside, but I'm sorry I have to bring it up. Björn mentions Third Strike in his video, and he argues that, well, if you're thinking about it on this theoretical basis, that, oh, having a parry makes the entire game solvable, easily solvable, whatever, because you can just hit it every single time, well, then nobody would throw out supers ever, right? You could just learn, unlike sort of regular normals, you could just learn the timing of that, or the timing of those animations as soon as you see the start of the super, and then it would never be worth doing, right? And that doesn't happen, obviously, so parries are not that bad, actually. And again, I'm sorry, I don't want to dunk on you, I just have to say it. Bro, nobody just throws out raw supers to begin with in fighting games. Nobody does that. You combo into the super. And even then, interestingly, I mean, that is not a new argument. Even that the parry ruins Third Strike. That is something that people say. I don't agree with it. I think it does make it a very rich game because, again, this is very different because fighting games are based on sort of intuition and conditioning the other player a little bit, but it's not the gacha that you may think it is. Now, while we're on this idea of thinking theoretically about what does the parry do for the overall health of the game, for the overall depth of the game, Boghog, indie dev, mentioned him before a couple times. I think this was a totally different context, but he said something very profound that is very directly related, I think. He said that game designers should always assume perfect execution. And that sounds crazy, and the reason, and he didn't say this is my interpretation, the reason that this is true is not because people are actually going to trivialize the game that way. Maybe that's not super realistic, but the reason this is still a good way to design a game is because it will make its limitations much more obvious. It will make it much more obvious where the cracks are exactly in your design. So clearly, I'm a nuance enjoyer. I'm an enjoyer of problems in games that don't have a linear solution. I like when things are a little fuzzy, a little ambiguous. I think that should be the goal of an action game. However, I do want to give a couple examples for games that I think implement parry mechanics, parry type mechanics, a little more judiciously, a little more thoughtfully. Again, I don't think just tweaking the timing is the solution. What you really want to do is you need to give the player more factors to consider. My favorite super easy example is Alien Soldier, where number one, using the parry uses ammo that you use to shoot the weapon with, usually. And also it knocks you back a little bit. And in isolation, okay, those are two factors, right? But like, it gets much more significant because number one, the screen space in general is very cramped. So every inch, every pixel matters. You really have a lot of situations where getting knocked back a little bit from executing the parry could get you into trouble. And guess what? Oh my god, you're considering the environment now, right? So doing a parry in this location versus that location now is different and now is a meaningful consideration. But then the other thing is that the ammo thing, it's not just putting a hard limitation on how often you can parry. It's significant because the way you rotate between weapons is very rigid. You bring up this weapon wheel and you swap, you rotate from one weapon to the next. It's all these fixed timings, all these hard animations that you can't get around. There's a hard amount of time that you need to factor in when you want to switch to a different weapon. And that itself interacts with the game's timer, right? Every sequence in the game is on a timer, and if you run out, you're cooked. So every little bit of time that you waste is significant. I don't want to act like this is the deepest, most interactive, most complicated relationship web in a game ever, but it is very easy to understand. It is very easy to understand how different things sort of ripple into each other and that you can't just autopilot like a lot of these other modern action games. Treasure in general were sort of good, this sort of thing. Bangai-O is another one that I thought about where you can fire back a blast of missiles if you have enemy fire incoming, and the specific amount of enemy fire determines the strength of your parry, but then your shots can still be blocked by the environment. So that's really cool. Now, I will say, again, part of the impetus for this video was the fact that I see people now throw the anti-parry agenda around very loosely and very easily. With Ninja Gaiden 4, it was especially funny to watch because we don't know how those parries work yet at all. And it's not like the other games didn't have similar mechanics. I'm not an expert on how that is balanced. I think most people agree that the parries in the older games feel kind of weak, generally speaking. And that's for reasons other than, oh, the timing is hard. That is one good thing about those games. It is a little more fuzzy. Sometimes you can get hit during it. The animations are a little weird. Your counter animations are a little specific. So on the one hand, I'm saying it's not incorrect to point this reactive, very short-term style of gameplay out as a negative thing, as a trend in games that is sort of unhealthy. I think Rex is on the money with that. But at the same time, every individual implementation still warrants analysis, and I think it warrants analysis under the lens of, okay, what makes the game richer, what makes it fuzzier, more ambiguous, the problems more interesting to solve. I think I do agree strongly with the sentiment. I think, again, Boghawk put it the same way, where if we're just making games where you do the QTE every time you're about to get hit, then you might as well go back to Simon Says. I don't fucking know. That's my video on parries. Hope that was valuable somehow. I don't know. Again, I tried to bring a couple different perspectives together into a single package. Let me know what you think. Bye.